Elden Ring. You may have heard of it. It's been taking up just about every waking hour of mine that I haven't spent at work or behind the painting table. Elden Ring shares a lot of its DNA and owes a lot of its heritage to the original Dark Souls trilogy. Now, the original Dark Souls was the game that really changed the way I think about video games. This brutally difficult and totally impenetrable action-adventure game really brought home to me how intelligent level design and also gameplay mechanics can make it fun to die over and over and over again. And that's what I did, almost as much as I have to Malenia in Elden Ring. It's Malenia, Blade of Mikola, I see. So when a few years ago I heard about a Dark Souls board game making its way onto Kickstarter, I was super excited to see how that would translate into a board game. And I've played it quite a lot with my friends. It's really good fun and you can play through a couple of different bosses in a row to give you that real Souls experience. I've slowly been chipping away at painting the models in the box, and so today I wanted to tackle painting the Gargoyle. This is a mini boss that in the original video game looks a little murky, indistinct. So I'm gonna have to be really focused with the paint job to make sure that I can get it looking interesting while still maintaining that original character from the game. In order to do this, I decided to set myself some focus points for the Gargoyle. Number one, it's rusty. It's seen thousands of undead attempt to ring the Bell of Awakening, and it's probably seen an Age of Fire come and go in the meantime. Meanwhile, thousands of rain clouds and thunderstorms have passed overhead, each of them weathering it and really leaving it with a rusted, dirtied down appearance. The overarching theme of decay and rebirth is really prevalent in the Souls series, so I wanted to translate this into my paint job. Number two, I wanted to use verdigris as an accent colour. As I mentioned previously, the Gargoyle is quite washed out and it's quite difficult to determine what the main colours are from the game. However, there is definitely some verdigris, or sort of the equivalent of rust on copper objects, which I can definitely use as a highlight colour. As this has quite an interesting bluish-greenish hue, it's going to really give some interest on the tabletop, so you have something to look at, and it's not all just washed out brown like it is in the game. So let's jump over into painting. I started by applying PVA glue all over the base before dipping the model into a mixture of sand and stones. I then went in with a toothpick to scrape this off of the base arc lines. Now these arcs are really cool as they determine which direction the boss is facing, and then the deck of cards for that boss determines what actions they will take in what arc they are facing. I'd previously primed the model black, and so I primed the sand and stones on the base with black as well. For the skin, I base coated using Wraithbone. I then wanted to dirty this down with a series of washes in order to get a sort of realistic, grungy, weathered appearance. But before I got to that, I needed to base coat all the metals, and I did this with my favourite silver paint, Gunmetal from Vallejo. You can see here I'm using a large makeup brush, and that's because I don't need to be too neat with this, so I can always come back in, and I found it to be faster to clean up with Wraithbone later, rather than worrying about being really neat at the first stage. I next applied Vallejo Air Metallic Rust over all of the areas I'd just painted silver, doing them a little bit at a time. Here you can see me doing this process on the shield. I applied the rust over, before then taking my dry brush and moving it over where I'd just painted. This scraped away some of that rust paint, and then I wiped it off onto a tissue and came back in to wipe off some more. With this you can start to see the metal showing through underneath, and this gives it a really uneven, rusted, ancient appearance. This is probably easier using the air metallic paints, as it gives you a bit more working time before the paint dries. Next, it was time to dirty everything down using a coat of Agrax Earthshade. I watered this down using airbrush thinner, about a 50-50 mix, and then applied it to the whole model. Now you do have to be careful of pooling, but the airbrush thinner does mean that this isn't so much of an issue as it should flow out more, but there is a really deep well in the Gargoyle's back, so watch out for that. I then went back over with a mix of Agrax Earthshade and non-oil over all the downward facing parts. In this way I keep them in shadow and draw the eye to the top of the model. Into these parts which were on the flesh, I also added in some Reichland Flesh Shade, just to again give that sort of patchwork of various different colours. To further add to this, I took some Seraphim Sepia and added it to the feathers at the base of the wings. I next lightened up the base using Vallejo Grey, before then recess shading over everything with thinned down non-oil. I thinned this down with airbrush thinner just like I did in the previous step. Next, it was time to actually get a highlight colour on, my verdigris. So first I mixed up what I thought was a good approximation of the colour. This was a couple of parts of Thousand Suns blue mixed together with Beal Tan Green wash paint. I then thinned this down using airbrush thinner so that it would flow really neatly into all of the recesses. While painting this on, I probably started off putting a little bit too much, but as you can see I just wiped it away or just used the brush to move the paint around a little bit. Eventually, I worked out that I could do a similar kind of dry brush method to what I've been doing with the copper paint from earlier. Here you can see me doing this on the head of the axe, applying a lot of the green paint and then just drying off my brush and then pushing the paint around into different areas. This helps to give an organic, random nature to where the verdigris has gathered over time. After leaving this to dry, I decided to come back in and do a second layer of verdigris just to double up on the effect and really give that idea that some places were very heavily weathered where others had escaped the ravages of time relatively unscathed. With the verdigris highlight applied, it was just a case of highlighting up my base using a lighter grey colour, which I made by taking my Vallejo grey and adding in a little bit of white. I probably applied this a little bit too thickly. I was aiming for a dry brush, but there were some times where I went in with a wet brush, so I did need to come back in with Nuln Oil in order to darken down some of the larger stones. To finish up the Gargoyle's paint job, I took some Mephiston Red and applied it onto the boss arc lines. I did have to scrape away a little bit of the basing material using a toothpick in order to get at them. Now this was probably the hardest step of the whole paint job, as you do kind of have to reach around the Gargoyle's feet to make sure that you can get to all of the boss arcs. Finally, for finishing touches, I added some mossy effects using Beal Tan Green onto some of the rocks on the base. I ended up thinking this looked a little too bright, so I ended up going back in with some Nuln Oil in order to matte it back down. To put a finish to the base, I applied a Gamer's Grass tuft to one of the quadrants, and then blended it into the scene by adding a little bit of Agrex Earthshade around the bottom. So having gathered all of the souls from that painting experience, I'm going to take them back to the bonfire and take a rest before my next adventure. Let me know who I should tackle next from Dark Souls in the comments down below. Unfortunately, there's no Millennia figure as of yet, as I would prioritize that 100%, because any place where I get to beat Millennia is a good place. In the meantime, my name has been Ollie, this has been my hobby, and I'll see you next time.